I buried my husband on a Tuesday in October, and by Friday, I was standing in the middle of a cornfield in a county I'd never heard of, holding a set of keys I didn't know existed, staring at a farmhouse that had his handwriting taped to the inside of a kitchen cabinet. 31 years of marriage. 31 years of sharing a bed, a bank account, a life, and he had another entire piece of his world hidden less than 90 minutes from our front door. What I found in that farmhouse didn't just break my heart. It exposed a lie so deep that by the time I was done pulling on that thread, it unraveled his entire family, and it changed who would inherit everything he ever built. Stay with me, because this story is wild, and it's true to how I lived it. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who believes the truth always finds its way to the surface, even the truth someone spent decades trying to bury, hit that like button right now, and subscribe if you haven't already, because I've got a lot more stories like this one coming. And I'd love to know where you're watching from tonight. Are you curled up on your couch after a long day? Driving home? Lying in bed with your phone 2 inches from your face like I do most nights now? Drop your city or your state in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, hearing from you is what gets me through writing these out. Okay, let's get into it. My name is Jennifer. I'm 57 years old, and until 8 months ago, I would have told you I had a good marriage. Not a perfect one. Nobody has a perfect one, but a solid one. My husband was a quiet man. The kind who fixed things around the house without being asked, who remembered how I liked my coffee, who called me Jenny in that low voice of his even after 3 decades. He ran a construction supply business he'd inherited from his father, and I taught 3rd grade for 26 years before I retired. We had 2 grown children, a modest but comfortable life in the suburbs, and a routine so steady you could set a clock to it. He got sick in the spring. Pancreatic cancer, and it moved fast, faster than any of us were prepared for. 4 months from diagnosis to the funeral. I won't dwell on those months because if you've lost someone, and if you haven't, I hope you never do. I'll just tell you that watching a strong man disappear a little more every single day teaches you things about grief you can't learn any other way. What I didn't know while I was sitting in hospital chairs holding his hand was that he was sitting on a secret so heavy it should have crushed him long before the cancer did. About 2 weeks after the funeral, once the casseroles stopped coming and the house went quiet in that awful, permanent way, I started going through his desk. Insurance paperwork, the will, account numbers, the unglamorous business of death. And tucked behind a filing cabinet, taped to the underside of a drawer like something out of a spy movie, I found a small brass key on a faded ribbon and a folded piece of paper with an address in the next county over. No note. No explanation. Just an address in his handwriting, dated 14 years earlier. I want to be honest with you. My first thought wasn't suspicion. It was almost sweet, foolish hope. I thought maybe it was a surprise. Maybe he'd bought land for our future, some retirement dream he never got around to telling me about. So I drove out there. The address led me down a gravel road past 2 other farms before I found it, a modest but well-kept farmhouse, a red barn that had clearly been maintained, about 60 acres of leased farmland, and a mailbox with no name on it. The key fit the front door on the first try. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Inside, the house was clean. Furnished. Lived in, but carefully, like someone who visited regularly but didn't actually reside there full-time. There were dishes in the cabinet, folded towels in the linen closet, a calendar on the wall, his handwriting again, marking dates going back years. Property tax due dates. A farm equipment maintenance schedule. And in a small office off the kitchen, a locked filing cabinet that took me another 20 minutes of searching to find the key for. What was inside that cabinet is what changed everything. There were land deeds. The farm itself, purchased outright 14 years ago, paid for in a lump sum that had never once shown up in any of the accounts I had access to as his wife. There were separate bank statements from a bank I didn't recognize, an account that had been quietly funded for over a decade with transfers I never saw, never questioned, because I trusted him completely. And there was a folder, thick with paper, labeled with a name I'd never heard in 31 years of marriage. It wasn't a mistress. I want to clear that up right now because I know where your mind might be going, because it's where mine went first too. It was worse in its own strange way, and also somehow sadder. The folder held decades of correspondence between my husband and a man who turned out to be his half-brother, a man born from an affair his own father had carried on for years before my husband was even born. His father, my husband's father, the man whose business he inherited, whose name was on our wedding invitations, who I called Dad for 20 years before he passed, had a second, secret family. A whole other son, raised 40 minutes away, who never knew his real father's name until he was well into adulthood, and who my husband had apparently discovered and quietly, privately, been supporting and reconciling with for the last 14 years of his life, without ever telling me, our children, or his sister and her husband, who had spent decades believing the family business and the family land belonged solely and cleanly to them. I sat on the floor of that farmhouse office for almost 2 hours, just reading letters, photographs I'd never seen. A man who looked eerily like my husband's father, standing next to my husband in the barn, both of them smiling in a way I recognized, because I'd seen that exact smile across the dinner table for 31 years. Here's what became clear as I kept reading. My husband hadn't hidden this farm out of betrayal. He'd hidden it out of fear. Fear of how his sister would react to learning their father had a whole secret son. Fear of the legal mess it would create around the family business, which had been built, in part, using capital that traced back to a life insurance policy their father took out, a policy that, according to the paperwork, may have legally been required to include this hidden half-brother as a beneficiary and never did. My husband had spent 14 years quietly trying to make it right on his own terms, in secret, funding this man's life, buying him this farm as a kind of restitution, all while keeping our family completely in the dark. It was noble in a strange way. And it was also the loneliest, most isolating decision he could have made, because it meant that when he died, I was the one left standing in the wreckage of a secret I never agreed to keep. I didn't confront anyone right away. I sat with it. I grieved twice, once for the husband I thought I knew, and once for the version of him I was only now meeting, 14 years too late to ask him a single question. But grief doesn't erase practical reality, and practical reality came knocking about 3 weeks later, when my husband's sister and her husband, his only living close relatives besides our own children, showed up at my house wanting to discuss the business. What they actually wanted, I realized within about 10 minutes, was to discuss the will, and specifically, to discuss whether I had any intention of sharing what they considered rightfully theirs. See, here's the part one hadn't fully processed yet. The construction supply business wasn't just his. On paper, due to some old partnerships structuring their father had set up decades before, my husband's sister and her husband held a minority stake, and they had spent years quietly resentful that my husband held controlling interest. With him gone, they assumed, reasonably, from their perspective, that everything would either come fully to me, or that they'd finally get to renegotiate their position now that the difficult sibling was out of the picture. They sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd once hosted every single family holiday for 3 decades, and his sister said something to me I will never forget. She said, "We just want what's fair. We built this family together." Fair. As if fairness was something she got to define, sitting in my kitchen 3 weeks after I buried her brother, while she had no idea what I now knew about their father, about the secret son, about the life insurance policy, about the 60 acres sitting quietly in the next county over. I remember looking at her and feeling something shift in my chest. Not rage exactly. Something colder and steadier than rage. Clarity. I didn't say anything that day. I told them I needed time, that I wasn't ready to discuss the business yet, grief brain and all that. They left, mildly annoyed, probably assuming I was a soft, sad widow who'd eventually just sign whatever they put in front of me. That was their first mistake. I spent the next month doing 3 things very quietly. First, I hired an estate attorney who specialized in exactly this kind of tangled family business succession, someone recommended by a friend, someone with no connection whatsoever to my husband's family. Second, I drove back out to that farmhouse 4 more times, and I met the half-brother. His name doesn't matter for the story, but I'll tell you that he was kind and confused and grieving too, in his own complicated way, and utterly unaware of the storm that was about to hit the family he'd spent 14 years cautiously, quietly getting to know through my husband. And third, I had my attorney formally request a full, professional audit of the original partnership agreement, the life insurance policy from his late father, and every financial document tied to the founding of that business. What we found confirmed everything in that folder. The life insurance policy, the one that had partially capitalized the business decades ago, legally should have named the half-brother as a partial beneficiary, based on the paternity and the policy's original terms, which had never been properly updated after his birth. It had been quietly, whether intentionally or through decades of neglect, kept from him entirely. That single fact meant the original capitalization of the business itself was legally compromised. It meant the ownership structure that my sister-in-law and her husband were so eager to renegotiate in their favor was sitting on a foundation that could be challenged in court by a legitimate, previously unknown heir. I want to pause here and just say, I didn't do any of this because I wanted to destroy anyone. I genuinely didn't. If they had walked into my kitchen that day with an ounce of humility, an ounce of how are you holding up, instead of treating me like an obstacle to their inheritance 3 weeks into my grief, I might have handled all of this quietly, privately, generously, even. But they showed me exactly who they were at exactly the wrong moment, and I decided I was done protecting people who weren't protecting me. So I called a family meeting. Not a casual kitchen table chat this time, a real meeting in my attorney's conference room with my sister-in-law, her husband, my 2 adult children for support, and yes, the half-brother, who I invited myself, and who showed up looking like a man walking into a room full of strangers who were about to become, whether they liked it or not, his family. I watched my sister-in-law's face when my attorney laid out the documents. I watched the color drain out of it in real time as she realized her father had lived a double life, that her precious family business had a legal claim hanging over it that neither she nor her husband ever knew existed, and that the only reason anyone in that room had a shot at resolving this quietly, without years of litigation and a public unraveling of the family name, was because I chose to bring it to the table in an organized, legal, careful way instead of just walking away and letting the courts sort it out for everyone. Here's the truth about revenge, the real kind, the kind that actually satisfies you instead of eating you alive. It isn't about screaming across a table. It's about being so thoroughly prepared, so calm, so completely in control of the facts, that the people who underestimated you have absolutely nowhere left to hide. I didn't raise my voice once in that meeting. I didn't have to. The documents did all the talking. In the end, we restructured everything. The half-brother received a formal, legally recognized settlement tied to the original life insurance discrepancy. Not a windfall, but a fair, documented resolution that finally, 14 years after my husband started trying to make it right in secret, made it right in daylight. My sister-in-law and her husband kept their minority stake in the business, but I retained controlling interest, cleanly and unchallengeably, because I was the one who had done the work to make sure the foundation was solid. And the farm, that quiet 60 acres my husband bought and hid and visited in secret for 14 years, I signed it over to the half-brother outright, free and clear, because it was never really mine to keep. It was my husband's apology, made in real estate instead of words, and it belonged with the person it was always meant for. My sister-in-law and I don't talk much anymore. There's a stiffness between us now that I don't think will ever fully soften, and honestly, I've made peace with that. Some relationships survive the truth. Some don't. I've decided I'd rather have honest distance than dishonest closeness. As for my husband, I think about him differently now than I did the day I buried him. I'm not going to pretend the secret didn't hurt, because it did, and some nights it still does. Keeping something that enormous from me for 14 years was its own kind of loneliness he chose, and it robbed me of the chance to help carry it, to know him more completely, to maybe even help him fix it faster and with less fear. But I've also come to understand that people carry shame in strange, twisted ways, and sometimes the people we love most make quiet, painful choices because they're terrified of losing us if the truth comes out. He was wrong to hide it. But he wasn't a villain. He was a man trying imperfectly in secret for 14 years to fix something he didn't break, and he ran out of time before he could tell me how. What I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all, is this: secrets don't stay buried. Not really. They just wait. And when they finally surface, you get to decide who you're going to be in that moment. Someone who lets the shock and the betrayal make all your decisions for you, or someone who gets calm, gets informed, and makes sure that when the truth finally stands up in the light, it's you who's standing there controlling how it lands. I chose the second version of myself at 57 years old in a farmhouse kitchen that wasn't mine, holding a folder that changed everything. And I'd choose her again. If this story meant something to you, I'd be so grateful if you'd like this video and subscribe, because it genuinely helps this channel keep going, and I have more stories exactly like this one coming your way. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you've ever uncovered a family secret that changed everything you thought you knew. I want to hear it. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't be afraid of the truth, even the kind that shows up 14 years too late.